Great. So then let's start the second lecture of this morning, and we're very happy that Zoe from E3M in Athens accepted to give a talk. She's been working also like a lot of experience in working in advisory of policy making on energy and climate policies, but also running energy and economic models. So very happy to give you insights on policy assessment and IEM. So yeah, also maybe a quick introduction about your own history path is on this slide. And yeah,
great. Thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and great to see you all here. This is it's a nice follow-up from the CityLink summer school that I had participated some years ago. And I'm Zoe Brodissi. I'm now the director of the Economic Impact Assessments team in IFRI Modeling. My background is in electrical engineering, but I have been working mainly with the CG macroeconomic model that we have developed in IFRI Modeling. IFRI Modeling is a spin-off from the National Technical University of Athens, and it's now a private company. And we are working both on research topics, and we have been contributing together with the integrated assessment modeling community to several projects and IPCC reports. But we're also working on consultancy projects and providing model-based evidence for policymakers to, well, their questions. This is an overview. I'll start with some ideas on the policy relevance of the socioeconomic assessments and give some examples of model characteristics that are being used and the dimensionality, which is key, let's say, to be able to address specific policy questions. I'll give an example of CG model structure, and the focus here is more on the CG model, since this is also my main capacity. But I will also go through the scenario simulation procedure and what this involves, provide some indicative results, and then very briefly discuss some emerging topics, including, the soft linking with energy models. This has also been discussed before, but will be very brief there. The distributional analysis, the regional analysis, and innovation and knowledge spillovers, and then provide some ideas on forward-looking topics. I think the presentation fits quite well with Nico's morning presentation. We'd not discussed in advance, but we managed to be complementary, so this is great. So similar start with Nico's. So, I mean, the challenges that we are now facing as a society and humanity really are multiple, and the integrated assessment modeling community tries to respond in a well-informed way to some of these challenges. I have put here the ongoing climate and biodiversity crisis, the increasing economic fragmentation and inequalities, the geopolitical crisis, and the pandemics and mental health crisis. So these are a few of the challenges that we are facing simultaneously all together. And the types of models that we are using mostly relate to the first two challenges. They try to respond to these questions that emerge, and to some extent also to the geopolitical crisis. So the macroeconomic models, they try to provide insights on how we both address the ongoing climate and biodiversity crisis, but also the economic and inequality challenges. Now, a few topics of policy analysis and what are the usual questions that can be answered by this type of models are, of course, the socioeconomic impacts of different emission reduction pathways, GDP and employment implications of specific and detailed climate and energy policies, the investment requirements and the financing gap, but also distributional implications across and within regions, skill gaps and declining jobs, emerging sectors and stranded assets, and trade and competitiveness implications. And the idea is to start from, let's say, a policy framework, and then through several considerations of, for example, technology innovation, finance, skills, human capital, behavioral changes. One enters the economic transformation system and then can assess the impacts of these policies. Now, I have put here a few recent examples of policy relevant assessments that we have done with GEMI3, but this can, of course, expand to what all models have been doing in the community, both in terms of research, but I chose here not to put peer-reviewed papers and publications, apart, of course, from the IPCC, but more like the policy relevant work. So examples include contributions to the impact assessments by the European Commission for the Fit for 55 policy packages. This is for a lot of the legislative packages, but here I've put just for the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and the Renewable Energy Taxes Directive or the Energy Efficiency. I don't remember which one I put. A recent study that we did, for example, for OECD on how the COVID-19 related fiscal measures, so the green recovery packages, can contribute to emission reductions and what are the macroeconomic implications of these measures. I've also put the Peseta report because usually most of the analysis and the presentation that I give here refers to the mitigation policies, but there are a number of instances where these models are applied also for climate cost assessment, and the Peseta report is such an example. But as Roberto said, it's rarely or never the case that we do those both at the same time, so assess both mitigation and climate cost. This is not really done with these detailed models. It is done with the type of simpler in terms of granularity IAM models. And then some work that relates to country-specific policies. For example, I put here for the Serbia transition to a greener and more resilient growth, where we did a number of scenarios for the World Bank. And there are a number of examples like that. And of course, the IPCC that Roberto explained very well, where we had, for example, contributed together with the rest of the community to the engaged scenarios and other type of scenarios. So very briefly, to go through the types of economic models that one can use for applied policy analysis. I'm not going to go into much detail here, but just to have this in mind, we have the econometric models, input-output models, maybe better to go here, the computable general equilibrium models, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, agent-based models, cost-benefit analysis, machine learning models, and network analysis models. I might have missed some categories of models, but there are a lot here. And I give a short description and some, let's say, key advantages and disadvantages, because we always have to consider that, there is no perfect model. And depending on the model type that we use, we can emphasize on the good stuff, but there are always caveats on the modeling side. So what, for example, the European Commission has been doing for its impact assessments on climate and energy policies is that it employs usually more than one types of models, so that it can tackle really the type of uncertainty that comes from the modeling structure. There are many types of uncertainties, and I'm sure that Celine will discuss about those during her presentation. One type relates to the actual model structure and the fundamentals and the theory behind the model, and this can somehow be tackled by employing more than one types of models for the same policy question. So the CG and the macroeconometric models are usually the ones that are being employed for the type of European Commission impact assessments, but also DSG models and increasingly now agent-based models. Now, so in order to, let's say, conduct a macroeconomic climate transition and physical risk analysis, this is now more like the terminology of what Roberto mentioned, of this type of the transition and physical risk analysis is now entering the terminology of what the banks and the financial institutions are using nowadays, with the NGFS scenarios that have been developed and the TCFD requirements that are actually a set of requirements that say to banks and financial institutions, but also to the private sector, that, look, you have to start thinking about climate-related risks, start using scenario work, either your own or existing scenario work that is out there, in order to start understanding what will be the effects of climate, both in terms of climate costs and transition, so climate policies, what will be the effect of these on your revenues, on your business cycle, etc. So the way to do this is, of course, start the scenario definition, employ a model, then go to the sector and macro level assessment of results, and then, if possible, go to a more granular level, ex post analysis, downscaling even to the company or location specific or distributional level. Now, macro models like a CGE type of model can enable a thorough understanding of the risks and opportunities of the transition and climate cost risks, because they give an overview of direct, indirect, and induced effects. With direct, we mean, so what are the impacts of putting, for example, a carbon price on a good? So how will its price and the demand for this good will be affected? The indirect impacts are those that come from, for example, intermediate demand, so the value chain effects. How do the prices of intermediate products change, or the prices of labor and capital inputs? And this can be captured by a general equilibrium framework. And then the induced effects are those that are related to the wider economic implications. So even if a sector is not facing a carbon price, it will be affected by the wider economic effects, macroeconomic effect, GDP, employment. It could be the case that the demand will be reduced or increased depending on the case, but there are changes that are related to the wider economic impacts. So starting from the scenario simulation procedure, of course, the hard part, let's say, of it is to get the data. This is always a challenge. And for example, a CGE framework starts from the social accounting matrix, but needs also to have information on labor markets. And then depending on the granularity of the model, other databases come in. I will discuss this later. You have to calibrate the model and then start your assumptions on some exogenous variable that will help you go towards the future. This could be technological progress or population, or depending on the model type and you know, the appetite for having a more detailed future projection. We will discuss this later in more detail in the reference scenario development. And then one would set up the scenario framework and have the reference scenario and the policy scenarios and compare those really in order to get to policy conclusions. So really the way that we are working mostly with economic analysis is in a comparative static analysis. So starting in the sense that we compare the similar years. I mean, the models are not static, but we compare the policy scenario in relation to a reference scenario. Now, a few words for the scenario definition, and then in later slides, I give some more concrete examples. So the scenario definition, apart from the reference scenario, which we'll discuss later, starts from climate, energy, and economic policies. These can be stylized, which is, let's say, the usual case in integrated assessment models, where you have a global carbon price, for example, or you start from a carbon budget, and then you, depending on the type of your model, you determine an optimal emission pathway, which, depending again on the type of the model, can result into a carbon price. But then you may also want to become much more specific in terms of policy analysis and actually start assessing specific renewable targets or energy efficiency targets, or even targets for vehicles like CO2 standards. And I will give more examples later, but the more granular you go in terms of policy assessment, the more you can actually respond to to specific policy questions. That makes sense. But then you lose, let's say, other elements, like, for example, the ability to employ a lot of models to respond and to get this uncertainty that one wants. Climate damages by sector, if one wants to assess the climate costs, and I have not put many slides on this, so if you have questions on this, we can discuss later of how we usually do it in the CGE framework. And then one needs to think during the scenario definition, how will these policies be financed? Because this is a closed economy system. So is it a loan-based system, for example? Where does the money come from? Is there self-financing that will lead to crowding out, etc.? Similarly, for the fiscal policy, what can be done with the carbon revenues if one has a carbon price? All this needs to be considered during the scenario definition. And then we go into the model, and some of the key outputs that, for example, GEMI3 model would provide are the GDP components. So the GDP components are the investment, government and private consumption, and imports and exports. And then one would go on the sectoral level and discuss also bilateral trade, employment by sector and skill, unemployment rate, if this is endogenous in the model, emissions, energy system projections, investments, but also discuss the type of private consumption, carbon price, and fiscal balances. I'll give some examples later. Also, the dimensionality is very important when one goes into the ex-ante policy analysis. So how many regions does the model cover? How many sectors does the model cover? CGE models have, because they are based on the input-output matrices and the social accounting matrix, they usually have the ability to represent a number of sectors, but also represent in detail the main economic agents of an economy, so households, firms, the government, and the international sector. And then the economic model needs to go and get more details and become hybrid, if one wants to say. So from a top-down type of model, incorporating some bottom-up elements. So it could be the case that there is a detailed energy system representation for power supply or transport. This usually is either much more aggregated than what a detailed partial equilibrium model would be, or the other option is, of course, to somehow link a partial equilibrium model with the economic model and then get, depending on the type of the linkage, merits from both model types. And then also including the environment. So this is what actually makes an economic model more like into an integrated assessment model, right? That it includes elements of energy and environment, not so much climate cost, but Roberto also touched this during his presentation. And yeah, this is an example of the coverage of the GEMI3 regions. So EU member states and a number of non-EU countries, the main economies, G20 countries, etc. And then in terms of sectors, for example, we have here this 68 economic activities. A number of these is related to the energy system. So the models, of course, develop and expand depending on the type of questions that we want to answer. So we, for example, we have very aggregated representation in the default model version of agriculture or services, but more detailed on energy intensive sectors or energy system sectors like transport, also sectors that manufacture the clean energy technologies like PV modules or wind turbines, so the sectors that manufacture batteries for electric vehicles. We try to explicitly represent those in order to be able to respond to some questions. And yeah, so let's say the granularity of the model could depend on the type of questions that one wants to respond to. Yeah, Nico showed us a similar circuit there. So GEMI3, like CGE models, it's a closed economy environment in the sense of the several markets are in equilibrium. So starting, for example, from the labor market equilibrium, where households provide the labor supply and firms determine the labor demand. Then we go to the product market equilibrium that is again defined both by the unit cost of production produced by the firms and the consumption preferences of the households. And then the money market equilibrium, where actually the savings of the households need to equal investments by firms, either on a national or a global level, depending on the closure, let's say, of the model. And then we have also the capital market equilibrium, but also the rest of the world, which determines, let's say, the demand for the bilateral trade. So all the markets are simultaneously in equilibrium in such a modeling framework. Now,
on the money market equilibrium, do you have money supply from the central bank or?
Not in the default version of the model. We have a version where we have like a central bank that finances, but the default model closure is that the money market equilibrium actually has the shadow price of the real interest rates at the global level. So, global savings would equal global investments.
Okay. And the capital stock, this is measured in dollars?
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, the capital stock is an interesting one. Again, depending on the type of closure. I will briefly touch this if we reach the final slides. Because, yeah, depending on the selection of whether you choose to have a capital market that is actually mobile, so a capital that is mobile across sectors or across countries, this can have a very important effect on results. We can discuss this later. So on the firm behavior, I will not go into much detail, but just to say that, for example, in GEMI3, this is an old, outdated decision tree and nesting of the CES, but in general, The production function is based on a CES, constant elasticity of substitution function. And depending on the type of the sector, this tree formulation, the nesting may change. So the substitutability between the inputs will change depending on the goods. So for example, we have another substitution for transport services compared to refineries, compared to services. And everything starts from the input-output table, really, which provides us, let's say, the calibration information on how a good is produced, what are the type of inputs that are needed, what is the value added, etc. And then we apply our elasticity substitution in order to be able then to do the policy analysis, right? And see how the system would move if relative prices would change. Now, the main assumption in our CGE model, not in all CGE models, is that of perfect competition and zero profit, which is quite restrictive. And this means that really revenues are equal to cost at the firm level. So all agents of the economy are small relatively in order to determine the prices. They are all price takers, and they are paid according to their marginal product. And then, I think the Armington I will mention later, but the Armington assumption is what determines the consumer preferences on the destination of the good that they will consume. So I'm not irrelevant. I have a preference towards whether I consume domestic or imported goods. We will discuss this later. The households, so this optimizes into the minimum production cost, right? And here we maximize utility for the household behavior. So the data that we base the behavior of households is really the consumption matrix and the consumption by purpose information that we get. And this is then translated through the consumption matrix into a consumption by product. Product is the sectors that I described before, so the 68 sectors that you saw. And in an older version of the model, the households could select between consumption and leisure. This is not anymore the case, but we might bring it back if we get a good research to assess more like the post-growth analysis of how the welfare goes beyond consumption and actually takes into consideration happiness or leisure or other indicators. So agents are rational in the CGE context, which means that they maximize their utility based on the budget constraint, and they do this given their preferences, so they are rational agents. And households exhaust their income. They can consume, here it's not put in the figure, they can consume or save based on the equations that we have put in the model. The investment is what makes the model recursive dynamic, in the sense that the investment decided today will provide to the model the capital stock with which it can produce in the future. And here we come to the capital mobility discussion, where there are options of capital mobility within a country, global and sector specific. So imagine that the analysis, for example, that we do for stranded assets, right? The capital mobility assumption is key here. What do you assume in the model? So what when a fossil fuel power plant is not operating. For the model, this is some capital that is not being used. Do we allow this capital to go and be utilized by other economic sectors or not? This is very important for the economic outcome of the model and also for the socioeconomic. Capital stock increases with investment and decreases with decommissioning. So really also with the depreciation rate that we have assumed. Currently, this is a constant rate, but it could be endogenous. We will discuss this later. And the rate of return on capital is endogenous. And the investment matrix is also key in order to be able to translate the investment decision of the firm into demand for products. This is also key for the type of energy scenario analysis that we do, right? Or for the linkage with the energy models. So the energy model would give you the type of investments that will be made in, I don't know, like megawatts for PV, etc. But then one needs to understand how is this translated into demand for economic goods, to understand also the implications on the economic system. And then we go to the bilateral trade, which is a very important feature of the CGE type of models, because it also determines a lot the results, at least in the type of analysis that we are doing. So climate and energy policies, we have seen that this is detrimental in the sense that there are competitiveness implications for a country, and stakeholders are always interested about this. So the bilateral trade is determined by the Armington assumption, which so the consumer has a preference with regards to domestically produced goods and imports, and actually even for the origin, the specific origin of the imports. And this will then determine the composite goods that will be consumed by the consumer. And this actually also determines the exports. So the domestic production is the sum of exports and domestically produced goods. So these are not perfect substitutes. This is the Armington assumption, really. You have some substitution between domestically produced goods and imports. And this determines, so for example, if I put a carbon price on one country, but then another country does not have a carbon price, how does the price of the good change? And then depending on the Armington elasticity that we have put here, we have assumed the change in exports would be then determined also by that. And this is why we'll sometimes do, let's say, a more like sensitivity analysis of those parameters. For example, this is a common sensitivity analysis for the type of CGE models. And then going also to the labor market, in our CGE framework, we have involuntary unemployment, and this is defined by an empirical equation. So this is where we bring together also these two worlds. So this labor supply curve is inversely relating wages and unemployment. This is determined on the skill levels in the default version, let's say, of GEMI 3. So if we have different skill types, there's an endogenous unemployment level by skill. And and then there are also assumptions on the labor mobility, right? So labor could be mobile within a skill and across sectors. So like all managers can move throughout the economic sectors, but labor cannot be mobile across skills unless there is some investment in human capital, which is a module of that a model can have, like endogenous human capital investments. Yes.
Why are these elasticities negative?
These elasticities are the, if I'm not mistaken, these are the elasticity, the sigma. So how the wage is determined by the unemployment rate, right? So the higher the unemployment, the lower the wage. But Nico, I will come back to you on this. Yeah. Okay. Any questions so far? Yeah.
I was just wondering, you said the model has 10 households. I was just wondering if what are their characteristics, how they interact, or if they interact or whatever.
Yes. I have a few slides for this later, but the 10 households are really determined, they are the income deciles. So the income level determines these households. And yeah, this is outside of the model. So it's a module that receives wages and incomes, and we do a meta-analysis in this module and then bring this back through an iteration to the model.
Thank you.
Okay.
So quite in the beginning, in the overview of different modeling types, you had the disadvantage for CGE being, I wrote down, normative versus realism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering what exactly you mean by that. Maybe you can comment quickly.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, the assumption of having rational agents, for example, how does this relate to the actual behavior characteristics of well, everyday consumers or everyday people? This is an example. Or whether, yeah, a normative assumption is also the perfect competition that we assume for the firm level.
Okay, so all these like idealizations of like perfect competition, perfect whatever, and rationality you take as normative decisions.
Exactly, and this is also in okay. So if you compare this with econometric models, which are actually empirically validated, so they somehow have this type of behavioral elements already incorporated, but these are estimated in the past, right? They are not, so an econometric model cannot really assume big structural changes in the future. And there are a number of issues. So yeah, one would see, let's say, bringing the best of the two worlds together. But as I said, for example, in the equation that I just showed on the endogenous wage that is related to the unemployment level, this is an empirical equation. I mean, which fits a normative system, but some elements of empirical estimations can also be brought in the CG framework.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay. So then I go quickly to the reference scenario development. So this serves as a projection that reflects usually current trends based on historical data and some key projections, for example, GDP, population, and it will serve as the point of comparison for the policy analysis. A few of the inputs that could be required for the development of a reference scenario is population projections, labor force, GDP growth, and all these would be at a country level, and then assumptions on labor or total factor productivity, international prices for fossil fuels, and then what are the policies that are in place, if any. So these are a few examples of input assumptions and data in order to get the reference scenario. For example, some of the sources that we have been using for the EU analysis is the EU reference scenario 2020 for the EU. Then for the GDP, it would be like the aging report. For other regions, IMF or OECD estimations, or the SSP, which are currently updated. And then population, so the UN world population, energy balances, etc. So there are a number of data and projections that enter, let's say, the model at this point. And I guess each model has its own way to prepare this reference scenario, because in essence, what we would be doing is calibrating the model to these exogenous assumptions in order to get the type of the reference world that we have assumed. Okay, these are a few examples, and always we see that the type of assumptions that we have actually determine the policy results that we will get. So, for example, if we have assumed that an economy is export-driven in the future, if our policy assessment relates to a carbon price or the carbon border adjustment, one would see that this assumption was critical, right? So if one assumes that the economy grows through exports, then a carbon border adjustment would affect the economy more than if one would have assumed in the reference that the economy is, for example, investment or consumption-led, right? So it's always important to have this clear, and this is always a discussion through the modeling intercomparison activities, where we try to harmonize the models to some extent to GDP growth rates or population growth rates, policies, etc. We are not always very successful in that. There are a number of reasons for this, but again, you see some uncertainty between the models. Also, historical data vary between the models, and these are some of the reasons that, despite saying that we have assumed the same growth rates, one sees different projections in the future. But this is also important, for the policy analysis and the scenario analysis, because since we are always reporting, most of the times reporting in terms of a reference case, one needs to know how different the models are, what are the differences that the models have assumed in the through the reference scenario. And then we go to the scenario framework. Here you cannot read anything, but the idea is so this is what the integrated assessment modeling community is currently using. This is taken from a new project, Elevate, where we are now updating actually the databases of the current policies and the NDCs. New Climate is doing this. And there you can find all the policies that would enter the models for a current policy scenario, and a number of different types of policies exist there. So it's not only emission targets, it can be renewable targets, fuel prices, it could be vehicle standards, etc. at a country level, and then these are usually related to a base year and a target year. So depending on how the policy is expressed and formulated. Again, here each model has a different type has a different way to introduce in the model these policies, and the scenario frameworks can also be even more detailed. So here I give you an example also for how a revenue recycling scheme is also relevant. A type of revenue recycling options that we use is, for example, recycling back in as lump sums to the households, or reducing social security contributions of firms, or reducing other taxes, or actually using this money to invest to green technologies. So the scenario framework can be as detailed depending on the policy framework. For example, assumptions on how the investments are financed, etc. We will discuss about this. This is the input that we had for the OECD analysis. The type of green recovery packages, and then you have all the details. So does this investment go to power production, renovation of buildings, rail infrastructure, you name it. I mean, electric vehicles, hydrogen, batteries, biofuels, CCUS, and depending then on the granularity of the model, a model can assess the different types of policies. And then we have, it could be more stylized if we want to have a more like model and sample type of analysis. So this was a recent work that we did on the equity principles, where one assumes the mitigation efforts, so the carbon budget, the type of governance, so whether there's global or fragmented action, but whether also these equity principles refer to a carbon club or an emissions trading system, etc., and then the different fairness principles. Okay, I will quickly go through some indicative results. Here, just to discuss how the different assumptions on financing would make the GDP and employment, so the main macroeconomic results, differ a lot. So in the left-hand side, we assume there that this is financed, the transition is financed through loans that are then repaid. And you see then that the results can actually be positive because of the driver of the positive effect of investments that actually counterbalances any negative competitiveness implications. And the same holds for employment. But once one assumes that all the funds, all the investments are domestically financed, so the crowding out, let's say, assumptions in the CGE framework, then the GDP results would be negative compared to the reference case. And then the third one shows a different revenue recycling scheme, which actually shows that the results become much more positive. And if, for example, one assumes that their revenue are recycled back to the economy through a reduction of social security contributions, which actually increases competitiveness, reduces labor costs, and has quite positive employment effects, because really the firms see a much lower labor cost compared to before. And yeah, you can see this positive effect. So this is just to give, an indication of how results can actually differentiate it via the assumptions that we do in this closed economic system of the CGE. Also, an example of a CBAM analysis for a country where you see here the decomposition of the GDP impacts, and you see that some small GDP reduction is expected because through the channel of the exports. And although investments can act in a positive manner, and also the reduction of imports acts positively to the GDP, overall exports are reduced. Similarly, this decomposition for an introduction of an ETS to a country, so of an emission trading scheme, where one would see that again it's via the export channel that the GDP is reduced.
Excuse me, I'm looking for the consumption numbers now. These are the private consumption is the light gray, and they are on the negative
Public
side.
consumption would not change really. I mean,
Yeah, but the private consumption being on the negative side here, if I see correctly, it's a little difficult to differentiate the colors.
yes.
What does that mean? So private consumption is
Drops.
reduced,
Yeah,
drops.
drops compared to the baseline. And here you see how much, I mean, in this graph, you see how much it contributes to the GDP. So GDP is reduced, let's say, by 2%, right?
Uh-huh.
And exports contribute to that by 1 or 2, 2% percentage points. But then you have investments as a positive driver here, because most of the investments happen in 2030 and 35. Yeah, private consumption drops, and here also imports drop.
Okay,
I mean, in
Thank you.
2030.
thank you.
Here you see, again, on the right-hand side, the analysis on the carbon border adjustment. When this is imposed on a specific country, how this would change, for example, exports on a sectoral level. And of course, you expect all the CBAM covered sectors to drop significantly. But then depending here on the assumptions for capital and labor mobility in the model, you may see other sectors increasing. And this is due to the assumption that we allow capital to move across sectors. So the price of capital falls because of the reduced demand in some capital intensive sectors like the energy intensive industries. And then you see that this cheaper capital can enter the production function of other goods that become more competitive compared to the reference scenario. And this is why you see positive results, for example, for a number of other sectors. So all these assumptions are critical to the results. Similarly here, and then sectoral employment results. This is a different example. This is from an analysis of the Fit for 55 policy package. And you see, for example, that yeah, this is reported in absolute levels, not percentage, just to understand the significance of each sector. So construction is, let's say, gaining a lot in 2030 compared to other sectors, and also market services because of the demand that the new investments generate. Again, this depends on the type of financing assumptions that one has made. And similarly, on the national and regional level, what is important in terms of driver of results is, for example, whether the countries are producers of the clean technology equipment. So if a country produces wind turbines or energy efficiency material, then they would probably gain from the transition compared to countries that produce fossil fuels or that are very carbon intensive, their economy is very carbon intensive. And then on the occupation side, so the skill level assessment, one would see, for example, a number of occupations dropping and others becoming more demanded. Okay, I'll skip this. This is the type of, I just put here this to see the type of consumption by purpose categories that one could have. This is what is also provided in the data sources. So this relates to the consumption matrix on the right-hand side. There's not much detailed in the databases for the energy-related consumption. And this is always putting a challenge on the type of distributional analysis that one may want to do. Because there's not much information either on the national level, but not also on the decile level. And I will go later. I'll skip this. Just to go here to the emerging topics. So start with a very brief discussion on how to soft link with energy system models. The type of variables that one type of CG model could take from an energy system model is, for example, the fuel mix by economic branch, the energy consumption, vehicle stock, investments, and electricity prices. Now, depending on the type of analysis that one may want to do, this can differ, but usually the fuel mix and the investments are, let's say, key. And then if one wants to also harmonize the model in terms of prices, this is, of course, also interesting, but it's let's say modeling team has a different approach on this. And going now to the distributional implications, I'll just go through this quickly so that we have some time for discussion. So inequalities are linked to both transition and physical risks. So the higher, the carbon prices can be associated to higher prices of goods, and this has implications on specific consumer types and households. But there are also technology gaps. So whether a household can actually afford a new technology. And there are implications from structural changes and job losses, for example, in the fossil fuel sectors. But also inequalities linked to physical risks, that hazards are not equally distributed across countries and regions, and not across locations where households live. And also the adaptive capacity of regions differs significantly depending on infrastructure, economic diversification, etc. So the approach that we have developed in order to assess these distributional implications is twofold. So we also assess the income-related implications of climate policies or climate cost, which in order to be able to do this, you have to have the linkage of the household type and what type of skills does this household have, or where are the people employed in this household. And then one may see through the economic model results how then the labor income is affected, for example, through a reallocation of workforce away from the fossil fuel related sectors. or stranded skills, especially for low-skilled jobs versus skill shortages, for example, for technicians that are needed for the transition. And then also understand what are the implications for other types of income, not labor-related income, but income that comes from dividends. So from the firm capital gains, and income that comes from benefits, social contributions and social benefits. So once we have all this information, we can understand what are the income-related distributional implications. And this is, of course, data dependent a lot, but yeah, we have managed to do this for the EU. Now, the other angle of distribution is, let's say, the consumption-related distributional implications, which relate mostly to how prices are affected because of the transition or the climate cause. And then, depending on the preferences of each household type, but also, for example, how vulnerable are the households to energy prices. This will be determined by the share of energy consumption of each decile group in its total consumption, right? If you see that a household spends like 30% of its income for energy purposes, one would assume that this is a vulnerable household, for example. And we've done the analysis on these two, let's say, levels, and see in a paper that we have published, for example, that there are negative implications for mostly for the lower income deciles with regards to the transition. But then if one assumes specific policies, like, for example, recycling the carbon revenues towards the usual recipients of social benefits, which are the lower income deciles, then one could see that actually there are also positive effects, and that only the richer households are then affected by the transition policy negatively. Okay, and then moving to the regional dimension, I'll briefly go through these topics. It's a lot of information, but just briefly to give an overview of what has been the key developments, let's say, currently for the macroeconomic models. So going to the regional level, to the subnational level, right? On the EU, that's the NUTS 2. I mean, for certain countries, data are available for this. China is a very good example where there is a lot of data at the subnational level. For the EU, there is some data, not much. I guess also for the US, there's a good level of data, but then depending on the country. And what we do, this is a simple approach, let's say, that we have developed. We have tried also more complicated approaches, but we have now narrowed this down to using an attractiveness index, which is a composite index that will help us actually build the input-output tables on the regional level and translate the GEMI3, so the national level outputs of employment and production at the regional level. And the country level results act as boundary conditions, but then the attractiveness index can actually show where the production would take place, where employment would come from, etc. And some of, let's say, key sub-indices for this attractiveness index is the resource endowments of each region, so the human capital, what's the type of education level that is there, the age cohorts, the infrastructure, but also then going into the more like energy and climate related data, so natural resources, in particular fossil fuel resources, energy related infrastructure like refineries, grids, renewable energy potentials and renewable energy plants, energy intensive industries like cement plants, for example. And then, yeah, depending on the appetite, one can expand. I have provided here some databases where we take the information from. There is quite some detailed information out there with regards to the location of power plants and renewable potential. But then if you want to go into the more like film level, so a current analysis that we are doing is also looking at the location of, for example, wind turbine plants, so manufacturers of clean energy technologies, then it becomes more challenging. And these.
So you put together different databases? Thanks. You put together different databases and unify it into one framework, but did you publish that unified data? Not? Do you plan to?
Publish? I don't think so.
Oh, that is a pity.
I mean, some of it will become available. I'm not sure about the details. So, you know, we might publish the attractiveness index. We're not allowed to publish. I mean, most of these databases are already publicly available. I think, yeah, almost all is publicly available. But then the difficult part, as you know, is when you actually reconcile the data. And so, yeah, we could provide the attractiveness index, so the final, let's say, product. You have the starting product, but then the intermediate sub-indices, I'm not sure that we will be able to provide. I don't know yet. Yeah, and this would then, I mean, for example, we've done recently, this has been published by the European Commission. This was an analysis on the NUTS2 level. You get an overview of which regions will be affected the most by specific policies and where you can see emerging sectors, so opportunities, let's say, the green opportunities, the red, more like negative effects. Okay, this was discussed also by Nikos. So I think I might skip this. Yeah, just to quickly say that usually models have these two types of learning representation. So the learning by doing and the learning by research. The learning by doing is, is let's say a global good, right? That the more that you invest in the capacity of a technology, all regions gain from this. While the learning by research, it's not a global good. It cannot be considered as such because of patents, etc. If this is private R&D, public R&D could be considered as a public good. And then depending on how, on what is the type of decision for the private R&D, then one model could have, for example, completely exogenous decision on R&D, but then still gain some learning by research. Endogenous decision of R&D where the firm knows the impact, or endogenous decision for R&D where the firm does not know what will be the impact, but sees it only as a, let's say, production input. And then what is critical here for a model is to the knowledge spillovers of the learning by research. This could be limited to a sector, but it could also be across sectors or across regions. And there are also the indirect spillover effects through trade, for example, or through value chains, right? So if I buy a good from China, this already has the R&D that was invested in China. But yeah, the firm in Europe will not be able to see the technology with which China produces unless there is some good spillover channel. And usually we also assume some time lags as well there, right? Because, I mean, if one assumes like the patent citation methodology to retrieve these knowledge spillover matrices, then one would see that there are some delays, at least 5 to 10 years for this technology to flow. Okay. And just one slide or two, a few ideas of topics for research advancements that we have been discussing with several, let's say, macroeconomic modelers. First of all, the labor market effects. So I discussed about the labor mobility, but then this is between, let's say, the perfect mobility or constrained mobility. How could one assume frictions between skill transitions? I mentioned briefly, so the human capital investments. So, for example, one decides to leave the labor market, go gain new skills and re-enter the labor market with these new skills. How does the model see this? And yeah, these skill limitations then across sectors and occupations. This is quite important now, you know, for the transition and the skill gaps, etc. But also elements of further labor heterogeneity, including also age and gender. Usually these are done in a meta model, yeah, ex post analysis, but it would be interesting to see what can be brought also in the model itself. Behavioral change, I discussed this briefly. So this is more like the discussion on normative versus non-normative. You know, the agent-based models, they have like this detail in terms of behavior, but like other elements. So how can these large-scale models bring some behavioral change? We sometimes do this now with perceived costs, for example, but then that will determine a technology uptake, for example. But what are the other ways to incorporate behavioral change related also to demand-side mitigation policies? I skip the one for marginal propensity to consume. It's more like economic. But then also the financial representation. This is also asked a lot. So how can the model capture, yeah, the level of financial requirements is straightforward, but then how much money is available in the market? How much is, let's say, utilized and how much is not utilized? And how can these investments then be generated? For example, we had this discussion now while assessing for the OECD project, while assessing the IRA policies, where we also discussed with some people that did the IRA analysis. There are a few modeling teams in the US that did the analysis. And a key question there is whether there is any crowding in assumed. So the states provide some tax exemptions. These tax exemptions can be translated into public funds in some way, but then do you assume that these public funds will bring in new private investments? So most of the policies are designed in such way so that they can actually bring in these private investments, because tax exemptions, for example, or subsidies, they only refer to as share and not the total investments. So I don't know, like 10% of the investment required. So where does the 90%, the rest of the 90% come from? And yeah, then one needs to capture also the international financial markets. Yeah. And finally, Roberto mentioned this yesterday, so I decided to add a few bullet points on the material flows representation, which is indeed a very current topic, also for critical materials, but also for the more like usual materials like metals and timber, etc. Especially now with the discussion on circularity of the economy. So how can one bring the material stock flow accounting into the model? We currently have, so the economic models are mainly into, they have the value flows in dollars. How can this, and we have now also elaborated the energy system. So we also have like TOE or kilojoule, whatever, but we don't have the material. So how many tons of steel is used by each sector, etc. And then going into more detail, so represent secondary and primary markets of goods, recycling, waste management sectors, etc. And then one could also go to endogenous product lifetime extension through repair services, etc. Yeah, shared economy is also part of the story. There have been efforts to include this in CG models. And finally, I'll skip the innovation. Finally, the uncertainty, which will be discussed later in the days, but this is always a hot topic in the modeling world. And yeah, how to go beyond parametric uncertainty, I would say, and beyond the type of Monte Carlo or sensitivity analysis that we are used to, and be able also to incorporate heavy-tailed uncertainty, which relates a lot also to climate costs, but not only limited to that. Yeah, thank you. I think I'm on time.
Yes, no, perfectly. Thanks a lot. Yeah, I think it was a big move from the energy and the part on sectors, losers, and from assets to finance, to labor, to skills. I mean, a wide range of topics. So yeah, are there any immediate questions or clarifications, comments? Nico has one, of course. Yes, you see the curious mind, and but we also will have lunch and of course time to discuss afterwards.
Yeah, I try to keep it short. You have all these economic parameters, elasticities, and so on. What are the three parameters that you would like to improve the most? So is it the Armington elasticities? Is it the substitution elasticities? Where do you think the econometricians could best help you because of the uncertainties and so on?
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Nico. I think the substitution elasticity is a key one, and it's rarely updated. So we have to admit that it's mostly the case that this comes from old data, or that we have adjusted it because we think that, in some cases, especially when it comes to energy related inputs, etc., we can have a better overview of the current developments compared to what is out there in the literature. So it would be great to get some updates there. And yeah, Armington as well, though I would say first the substitution elasticities, then what is related to the labor supply curve is also quite important in our case. And then elasticities on, and also data on the marginal propensity to save for the households. So, I mean, this is usually not changing a lot, but it's quite key in the model. So how much of its earnings the household tends to spend or to save. Again, this is outdated data. Thank you, Nico.
Thanks. Yeah, good points. Yes, if there's any question, please raise your hand. Okay. There's some.
Thank you. So my question is about the learning rates, like learning by doing and learning by research. Okay. So my question is about the technologies that are not there yet. How do you deal with that?
That's a good question. So technologies that are not there yet, we don't have this well, in the GEMI3 framework. I know that other models do assume for how you call it, sorry? Yeah, backstop technologies, exactly. So a technology enters the system after assumed carbon price, for example. In GEMI3, we don't have this, but there are technologies that we have, for example, hydrogen or synthetic fuels, where there is no information really, econometric information on learning by research or learning by doing rates. There, yeah, we don't have yet learning by research and learning by doing for hydrogen and clean fuels. So we have it for all the renewable energy technologies, batteries, and CCS, and that's it.
So
that's a key also, a missing data or gap. I mean, one could assume, one could see, okay, what does the literature give for CCS? We can use this, for example, for hydrogen. But we look at the literature and really the estimations that they give for hydrogen cost reductions are huge. So what we do is mostly that we actually calibrate the cost of hydrogen from an energy system model, primes mostly, which is a European model that we have, and we don't change this via any type of learning. We just have this decreasing in time via TFP, and yeah, this is the way to do it.
okay, thank you.
You talk about the deciles. Are these the deciles, the consumption? Are these deciles global, or are they by region or country? And also, all people from the same decile consume in the same way, or are also like a distribution inside the decile?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. So what is already there, I mean, operational is at the EU level, but Johannes did a great work now, I don't remember in which project, to have the data also for non-EU countries, right?
Yes, some, yeah.
Some. So this is work in undergoing, but we have this for the EU countries. In the default version, we don't assume an interdecile distribution. One can do that. I mean, there is the data to do it, especially if you take the microdata and link it to the model. But at the moment, what we have is one consumption pattern by decile, and also, quite importantly, one skill pattern by decile. And this is very limited information. So I don't know the type of work that you did for the non-EU. I don't think it has the income related. It's mostly the consumption preferences, right? Yeah.
Yeah, good point. I mean, that's yeah, we worked a lot on deciles in Navigate and Wheelwork and the Prisma project, where we extended to gender, also deciles by gender and by urban and rural households. But within deciles, yeah, I mean, you can of course assume some parametric distribution, but I think, yeah, I mean, that's one gap for sure.
Short question.
Yes.
For the soft linking, I was wondering what exactly soft link with? What outputs are you looking for?
So what type of outputs we use from the energy system model?
Yeah, well,
Yes, so the idea is, so soft link is, a very general term. It can mean anything for its modeler, really. But yeah, the idea is to use some output from a partial equilibrium model, usually, that enters the general equilibrium model in our case. So it would be, for example, an energy system model that will provide data inputs to the economic model. And the inputs could be that, imagine that both models run the same scenario, policy scenario, let's say the Fit for 55 EU policy package. And then one decides which outputs to take from the energy system model. So this could be, for example, the power mix, or the investments by technology, or the penetration of electric vehicles, for example, the share of electric vehicles, or yeah, I mean, investments. I mean, one has to consider also the costs in order to bring the two models together. And yeah, depending on the appetite, then you can have a number of iterations to see how this will close. Yeah.
thank you very much.
Hey, yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for the presentation. I think it was really nice and indeed continuation of the talk. Maybe, I mean, maybe you could have the goal of adding to the M's that Nico started with every talk, adding more M's. For sure, your M was like the M for markets, maybe. So you have the market on labor, capital, all the sectors. Then we can have multidimensional SDGs by that level, and we think about Valentina and K1. So yeah, I think hopefully a really nice capture of all these different models and also different features they all address. So yeah, I think we just ate a few minutes into lunch, so you have plenty of time. So thanks again, Zoe, for accepting. And yeah, the presentation will be shared in the folder. Feel free to reach out until, I don't know, when you're here exactly, but yeah, good to discuss. Thanks for the discussions, and yeah, lunch should be over there. So